Hi, my name is Maya, and this is for recorded discussion number 2. So, for the first question, Madison Grant was the first to start the name Nordax, which was the name for the certain race, the tall, blonde haired, blue eyed white Americans. He believed that that race was going to rule America, and in order for him to accomplish that, he was not going to allow the Nordax to mate with others, which was easy coming to the fact that later on, the Immigrant Act does come apart and banned the Asians, but as well as the blacks and the whites weren't able to mate. It was actually against the law for them to be in a relationship, or in other words, mate as well. Um, Charles Davenport was another one that believed that white intelligent Americans should only mate within themselves. In other words, if not, there would be an overload of immigrants that were coming to their country, and they weren't going to be able to stabilize the immigrants coming in and their version of white intelligent Americans. They were going to end up mixing, and they wasn't going to have enough white intelligent to be able to rule America as they wanted to. In the documentary, Davenport states that he had a fear that the right sort of Americans weren't having enough children, as well as during that time there was a heavy number of immigrants coming from the northern and western Europe, specific in the British Isles, Germany, and then in the 1980s, in the 1890s, correction, the Eastern and Southern Europeans started to enter the U.S. Those were also known as the Catholics, the Jews, and the peasants. So Davenport really emphasized mainly on the white Americans, the intelligent white Americans, to reproduce and to have multiple amounts of children. The more children they had, the more they were going to be able to reproduce and stop the overflow of immigrants coming in, and stop not having a mixing of them, and the Americans were going to be able to rule. For the second question, in the documentary, the narrator says more and more farms were giving way to factories, and the cities were overrun with newcomers, many from the countryside, hundreds of thousands were from abroad. So this also goes back to the Eastern and the Western and pretty much all of Europe coming into the U.S. and searching for that better life and wanting to better themselves for their families as well. This gives us, the viewers and current citizens of the U.S., a view of why people were coming in, and how they as well back then, decades and years, millions of years ago and hundreds of years ago, people were trying to come into the U.S. as they still are today. As U.S. citizens, it's hard to see Mexicans and African Americans and Asians trying to come into our country, who are trying to run from places that they've tried, from their homes where they don't feel safe anymore, and trying to find a better place here and still not being welcomed. With the Immigration Act, it was harder for people to run from the danger in their homes to find a better life. Only 2% of the number of people in the country were allowed to come into the U.S. That is as well as banning Asian countries such as China, Japan, and India. Those people were not allowed to come into the U.S. during the Immigrant Act. I believe that the U.S. is such a huge country, and one of the biggest factors that comes into par with the U.S. is your race and your ethnicity, and how you're going to fit in, if you're going to fit in. There are so many different states in the U.S. where you will find a 0.5, 0.4% of African Americans, 0.2% of Hispanic heritage, Latino, Asian ethnicities and race in those countries, because it is so widely dominated by what we'd go back to say the Nordex, which are the tall, white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Americans, and they still rule certain, even cities and states to this day. And I think that we aren't in that same place as we were before, but there's times where we do seem to be decreasing and going back into those olden days, where certain people aren't safe in even the U.S., nor when they're back home, so they have nowhere truly to go. And I think that if we are known as such a safe haven for so many people, that we can become that safe haven again and make our home safe for everyone, no matter where they come from. For our last question, race and ethnicity seem to be one of the greatest things that influence the U.S. Currently, the U.S., we are fighting for our lives with the Mexican immigrants who came into our country for a better place for their families. There are so many Mexican immigrants who are looking for a better home and a better place to raise their families and give bigger upbringings for their homes and their families and their children to come. And we are not welcoming them enough. We are not giving them the American dream that they're looking for. And the 1900s, the only people who were considered Americans and treated had a safe place for them were the Nordaks, which were the tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Americans. Those didn't have to worry about them being harmed or mistreated or maltreated in their industry or in their homes or anywhere, as they were the ones that were actually asked to reproduce more of their kind, especially if they were intelligent, especially if they were the intelligent, tall, blonde hair, blue-eyed American. Reproduce, 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 and only reproduce with your kind. So that kind of set them aside from everyone else because they wanted to build an American version of intelligent Nordaks, which isn't the way it works. There was a lot of natural selection that was not considered. So instead of being able to go out and find your person in a bar or in a restaurant or in a school, you were actually just put in a place where these are the Nordaks and you reproduce within here, not anyone else in the outside vicinity. And so that was that kind of put a moment into their natural selection and not allowing them to explore more, but letting them just stick to their Nordaks. It wasn't until later on that they started to breed the African Americans, and they started calling them the best of blacks, also known as the talented 10th, so the 10% of the best blacks were only able to reproduce within themselves. So they themselves, that 10%, those talented 10th, could only reproduce between them and not other African Americans, as they wanted to reproduce and create the best blacks within beauty, efficiency, and brains. So that is my recorded discussion for number 2.